What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another leader video, and today we're going to be covering the Green Queen herself, Green Bonney. This control leader has been the best option for green players since her release in OP07, and this isn't changing in OP10. And with the recent ban list targeting some of our most difficult matchups, both Bonney and green stocks are set to rise. So if you're a fan of this color and like the idea of playing defensively and keeping your opponent's characters rested, then she's the leader for you. Now let's get started. Oh, and one last thing, I'm trying to release a leader guide every week, so if you like seeing content like this and want to see more, please like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments below, what leader would you like to see next? Bonney's ability activates on our opponent's turn, and allows us to rest one Dawn and then rest one of their leaders or characters. To avoid any confusion, you cannot use this to stop the first attack that comes your way, as soon as that attack is declared, that character or leader is already rested, and your leader ability will not work on them. But where this ability gains value is when your opponent has multiple attackers. In this example, the Luffy leader has declared an attack and I'm unable to rest him. But what I can do is activate my leader ability and rest this Usopp so he cannot attack on this turn as well. Most of the time, you will use this leader ability defensively, protecting yourself from multiple attacks on the same turn, but you can also use it as a utility option, resting one of their blockers in order to get around it, or another useful card that you want to target with an attack next turn. Moving on to strategy, Bonney is more of a slow burn leader. We're not going to start off the game very aggressive, we're not going to gain advantage early on, it's by drawing out the game and getting to some of our high cost characters where we start to turn the tides. This leads into our second goal, where we want to outvalue our opponent, either by restanding our own Dawn so we can activate it again, or freezing their characters to prevent them from refreshing. And finally, our third goal is to get to the late game and set up our defensive fortress using Captain Kidd, some of our low cost blockers, since when he's rested our opponent is forced to attack him, and if we combine this with a blocker as well as our leader ability, it becomes very difficult to take him out and target our life. We then follow this up with one of our 9 or 10 cost characters and use them alongside Captain Kidd and our leader ability to further build up our advantage. While we didn't receive any new Supernova cards in OP10, 2 of the Punk Hazard cards are quickly becoming staples since they have such great synergy with Bonney. Smoker is a 5 cost 7k power character with Banish, which can be great for some early aggression, but the main benefit here is his activate main ability to restand one Dawn. This means on our 5 Dawn turn, we can play Smoker and then still restand a Dawn to use our leader ability. Not to mention, we can pair this with the 5 cost Cavendish to restand a total of 3 Dawn every turn. Tashigi has also become a staple in this deck, not only being a 2k counter, but by having her on the field, we can protect our other characters from any type of removal effect. Historically, this has been one of Bonney's biggest weaknesses, with really difficult matchups into black leaders like Lucci or Smoker. And so this card will really help with those matchups, as once we get it on the field, it ensures they have to remove this card first before targeting any of our others. And speaking of removal, OP10 introduced 2 new event cards that can be used to KO our opponent's rested characters. These cards haven't seen any play just yet, but this could change moving forward. Deck building with Bonney is really fun because we have loads of cards to choose from, but the challenge with this is figuring out which cards and how many of each to include. So first I'll go over every card that you can include before recommending my starting deck list and talking about the adjustments you can make as you try out this leader yourself. To start, we have the 1 cost Capone blocker, which can be nice for some low cost defense. The main drawback to this card is it doesn't have any counter, and being 1 cost, it's very easy to remove. This 1 cost Bonney is the only searcher we run in this deck, and by resting her in 1 Dawn, we can search the top 5 cards of our deck and add a Supernovas type card to our hand. We can use this to find cards we want to play on following turns, add some extra counter to our hand, or even find another copy of this card and either add it to our hand or play it down on that same turn. In the past, players have used this Baby 5 searcher as well, but given the very few cards you can actually find with it, it didn't really make sense, and they've since swapped it out for other cards on this list. The main reason we run this Scratchman is he's a searchable 2k counter, but his ability can be useful if your opponent has a 2 cost blocker or other card we're trying to remove. The same can be said for this 2 cost Scratchman, but I'm convinced his ability could be a secret technique against purple players, as by attaching one and attacking with them, we could rest one of their active Dawns and prevent them from using Gum Gum Giant. Now, have I successfully done this yet? No, but the idea is there, so maybe you will. Killer is the first of our 2 key low-cost blockers that we use in combination with Captain Kidd to set up our fortress in the late game. You also want to try and take advantage of his ability, as by attaching 1 Dawn, when we do block, we get to draw a card, which is fantastic, especially for green, as we have very few draw options within this deck. Now, this does require 3 or more characters on the field, but this includes Killer himself, so you just need him and 2 other characters, and the effect will activate. Despite its low cost, this Rosinante is one of the best cards in this deck. This is because of his ability, where on our opponent's turn, if one of our other rested cards would be KO'd, we can trash him instead. And for your reference, there's 2 types of ways to KO a card. The first is through battle, and the second is through card effects. But Rosinante protects our rested characters from both. This also means that he can essentially block without blocking. So even if our opponent rested him or activated an effect that prevented any blocking, we could still use his ability and prevent that card being attacked from being KO'd. At first I was surprised more people weren't running this 3 cost blocker, since with our leader ability we'll rest a card almost every turn, and drawing and discarding could be really useful. Then I realized that this only activates on our turn. And outside of Hody Jones, we don't really rest cards on our turn, so the value here is very limited. A better 3 cost option is this Raizo, who has the 1 attacking effect that if we have 2 or more rested characters, we get to draw 1 card. We also rest him when we declare an attack, meaning all we need is one other rested character in order to draw this card. And while he's not much of an offensive threat at 4k power, if we have Captain Kid on the field, we can protect him from attacks and attack with him each turn to continue to increase our hand size. We did talk about TCG before, but to summarize, this is a great card, a 2k counter, and if we're worried about any type of removal, we play her down and protect our other characters. While we can't search for this card, we do run 4 copies, so there's a good chance at least one's going to come into your hand some way through the match. This 4-cost 5k power blocker used to be pretty popular with the end of turn effect to reactivate one of your Dawn. With the addition of the OP10 Smoker into this deck, this ability has lost some of its value, as Smoker's ability states that once you activate it, you can no longer reactivate any Dawn with any character effects for the rest of your turn. This means if you have both Smoker and a Rouge on the field, you cannot benefit from both of their effects. With that being said, the argument to include him would be you now have him, Cavendish, and Smoker as all options to restand Dawn, meaning you have a higher chance of finding at least one of them throughout the game. Moving on to our 5-cost characters, we start with another Bonney that has the on-play effect that up to one of our opponent's characters or Dawn will not refresh at the start of their next turn. This can be very powerful against certain leaders, as it allows us to disrupt their Dawn curve and make them wait another turn before playing out a specific card. As an example, we know on their 7 Dawn curve that Usopp players want to use Rebecca into Kyros into another 4-cost card. But on our 6 Dawn turn, if we played this Bonney and froze one of their Dawn, they would only have 6 to work with and would have to wait another turn until their 9 Dawn turn in order to activate this. This could also be useful against Shanks to prevent their 10-cost Shanks or 10-cost Gold Roger from coming down. And while that Bonney is useful in some scenarios, this 5-cost Carrot is going to be useful no matter what leader you're playing. This is because both on play and when attacking, she allows us to keep one of our opponent's 7-cost or lower characters as rested, meaning they won't refresh on our opponent's next turn. This ability has great synergy with our leader ability as well, as we can rest one of our opponent's cards when they attack and then drop down Carrot to keep them rested as the game goes on. Carrot can also be used against cards that have on-KO effects that you don't want to trigger, as rather than KOing them and activating it, you can just use her to continuously freeze them. One of the best cards in our deck and what allows us to restand our Dawn is the 5-cost Cavendish. On play and when attacking, he allows us to restand 2 Dawn, which means we'll essentially play him for 3 Dawn on our 5 Dawn turn. This also means we get to use 2 extra Dawn per turn once we get him out there, so on our 7 Dawn turn, we could actually spend 9, as we could drop down a 7-cost Hody Jones, but then attack with Cavendish to restand 2 Dawn and keep one up for our leader ability. This can also be a game changer at our 8, 9, and 10 Dawn curves, as if we only have 8 Dawn available, we could still play down Captain Kid, attack with Cavendish, get that extra Dawn, attach it to Kid, and then activate his ability to summon out a 3-cost character and force our opponents to attack it. And this would still leave 1 Dawn available for us to use our leader ability on our opponent's next turn. Now, with the addition of Smoker, we have more options to restand Dawn, but Cavendish remains our best bet with restanding 2 versus Smoker's 1. Also, important to note, this only works if there's not another Cavendish on the field, so no, you cannot have 2 down and restand 4 Dawn on the same turn. This 6-cost Basil isn't always included in Decklist, but he's one of my favorite cards since he has immunity similar to Ace, where once per turn, if he would be removed from the field for any reason, we can rest one of our opponent's characters instead. As I've mentioned before, removal cards have historically been an issue with difficult matchups into black leaders, but this card helps us against that, as not only is he a 7k power character, but he turns into a blocker since Bonney is a supernova card. Now, because he's 7 cost, you might think that we always play this on our 7 Dawn curve, right before we drop out our Kid and Shanks and other cards like that, but in reality, this card is our closer. We generally want to keep him in our hand and then use his ability to rest our opponent's Dawn or blockers to clear the way and allow us to win the game. Also, losing a life goes directly against our main strategy to stall out the game and stay healthy, so it's not always a good idea to play him just because you can. Does this mean you should never play him at 7 Dawn? Well, no. If there's a specific card you want to target or an advantage that you can seize by playing him down and attacking early, then by all means go for it. I just mean you don't want to play him for no other reason than just getting him on the board and losing a life. Captain Kid forms the core of our defense, and using him correctly is either going to make or break you as a Bonney leader. His first ability requires 1 Dawn to be attached, and if he's rested on our opponent's turn, our opponent is forced to attack him rather than anything else. He also has the Activate main effect, where we can rest him and play 1 character with a cost of 3 or less from our hand, meaning we can rest him on the same turn we play him. And most of the time, we want to use this ability to either bring down a blocker, or if we already have one on the field, perhaps a Tashigi, in order to continue to protect him throughout our opponent's next turn. In an ideal situation, we will have another blocker on the field, our opponents will be forced to attack the Kid, and we'll still have 1 Dawn up for our leader ability, meaning we can stop 2 potential attacks. One by using Rosinante to protect our Kid, and the second by using our leader ability to rest either the leader or another character that can attack. This 9-cost Shanks is a great late game option, allowing us to KO any rested character no matter their cost or power, and also leaves 1 Dawn up to still use our leader ability. This card really helps us against high-powered characters that we might struggle to remove through combat, and at 11k power, he's going to be an offensive threat to pretty much every card in the game. Next is the 9-cost Zoro, who can be an amazing finisher if you use his ability to attack 3 times in the same turn. The main problem I've had with this card is it can feel clunky to play at times, and it feels like so often against difficult matchups, they always have an answer to it to remove him before I even get to attack. But if you can figure this out, this can be a game changer, as you can attack 3 times, or even attack twice and keep him active so your opponent can't target him. And finally, we have the 10-cost, 10k power Doflamingo, who on play allows you to freeze up to 3 of your opponent's characters or leaders. This is an amazing late game changer since you're essentially hitting the pause button on your opponent's characters, allowing you to target them with attacks 2 turns in a row, and on your second turn, you'll be able to target them with your Doflamingo. And if you have more than one in your hand, you could freeze these cards throughout multiple turns and drop out 10 cost characters while targeting with attacks at the same time. And that's the end for characters, but there are 2 different events that you can run, the first being the 0 cost counter that allows you to discard 1 card and give one of your characters or leaders plus 3000 power. This card is a requirement since we run so many counterless cards, as it allows us to discard one of them from our hand and still give a boost to one of our characters or leaders. The second option is the 3 cost Electrical Luna, which allows us to keep all of our opponent's characters with a cost of 7 or lower rested throughout our opponent's next turn. This card isn't that popular right now, but I think we'll see a rise in this card as the EBO2 Green Purple Luffy becomes more and more popular upon its release. For the starting deck list, I tried to go with a balanced approach and include as many cards as possible so you can try them all out and start to figure out which ones you prefer. It's also more common to see 4 copies of either Hody Jones or Shanks if they are included in a deck, but I also wanted to run 3 copies of Dofi so you get him in your hand in a few different games and figure out if he makes enough of a difference to include as well. I also running 1 copy of Raizo as I think you can get some great value in some games using his ability, but feel free to swap this out and try the 9 cost Zoro, or increase one of our 3 times copies to 4 times, or even just add another 2k counter. I'm also a fan of Basil Hawkins, as I find he can be very useful in certain matchups, but with some black leaders taking hits from the upcoming bans, if you feel like Tashigi is more than enough removal protection, you can swap this out for either the 5 cost Bonney or 4 cost Arouge. As you can see, there's a lot of flexibility with deck building with Bonney, which is a double-edged sword because it can make it really fun and you can personalize this deck and how you want it, but it can also be quite challenging to figure out your final deck list. My main advice for this would be to make consistent minor tweaks as you test out different strategies, rather than blowing it up and changing 6 cards at the same time. See what works, see what doesn't, and at the end of the day, choose the cards that you want to play and what feels right for you. And while I don't mean to overwhelm you with options, here are a few more cards that could provide some value to your deck. The first is the 5 cost Enel, who on play, if you have 2 or more rested characters, allows you to draw 3 cards and discard 2 from your hand. Drawing power and cycling through cards isn't a strength of green, so having a card that allows you to do this can be very useful. We then have the 8 cost Rosinante, who on play allows us to rest this character and play 1 green character with a cost of 5 from our hand. He also then has the added effect, on our opponent's turn, if he is rested, our active characters with a cost of 5 or less cannot be KO'd by effects. This can be useful against black or yellow leaders if you're finding your 5 cost characters are getting popped before you can even do anything with them. And finally, we have the 2 cost Straw Sword event, which allows us to rest one of our opponent's characters, which can be very useful in certain matchups. For our Dawn curve, we generally like to go second, but we will choose first against leaders that want to do so, such as Blue Dofi or Purple Luffy. At 1 Dawn, our best play is our only play, our 1 cost Bonnie Searcher, dropping her down and not activating her ability yet, as that requires an additional Dawn. At 3 Dawn, we can either activate our Bonnie to search for a Supernova card, or drop down a 2 cost blocker. We have enough Dawn to do both, but if your opponent has a low cost character of their own on the field, we want to keep at least 1 Dawn up to use our leader ability. Let me explain. In this example, I'm playing against Dofi, and on my first turn I drop down my Bonnie, and they drop down their own Perona. I then activate Bonnie's effect, add a card to my hand, and I now have 2 Dawn to work with. Now I could play one of my 2 cost blockers, but that leaves 0 Dawn up, and here's the problem with this. Perona has 2k power to my Bonnie's 1, which means next turn they can attack my Bonnie with Perona, and then attack my life with Dofi. And to stop both of these attacks, I would need to either use the blocker I just played down, or use a counter. However, if I leave 1 Dawn up, my opponent will now be forced to either target my Bonnie or my life, but they won't be able to do both. This is because as soon as they declare their first attack, I'll use my leader ability to rest their second character or leader and prevent that second attack from going through. So in this example, they do get to attack my life, but because of that, I rest their Perona and my Bonnie stays safe for another turn. At 5 Dawn, we want to play Cavendish or Smoker to start restanding our Dawn and getting more value from our turns. In general, we prefer Cavendish as we can restand 1 more Dawn with his effect, but there can be some scenarios where Smoker's 7k power or banish ability is preferred. Either way, both are great options as we can play them and restand at least 1 Dawn in order to still benefit from our leader ability. At 7 Dawn, we have a few different options, starting with playing either Smoker or Cavendish if we had both in our hands and played the other on the previous turn. We also gain access to Hody Jones, but as I mentioned before, you only want to play him if you're really gaining value from his effect by resting and targeting certain characters. This is also where Carrot or Basil Hawkins can come out to either freeze one of your opponent's characters or get a 7k power blocker that's very difficult to remove. At 9 Dawn, your best play is going to depend on what you currently have on the field. If you have a Smoker or Cavendish, the Captain Kid Fortress is probably your best play, as you can play him, attach 1 Dawn and activate his ability, bring out a low cost blocker, and then use Smoker or Cavendish to restand a Dawn for your leader ability. You could also use the 9 cost Shanks to remove one of your opponent's rested cards, and then once again restand a Dawn to still use your leader ability. And if you're running the 9 cost Zoro, you could also drop him down now and get ready to attack 3 times on your next turn. At your 10 Dawn turn, you can now play Doflamingo and should use him, Shanks, and your other 5 cost characters alongside your Captain Kid Fortress to overwhelm your opponent. When going second, we can both play and activate Bonnie's effect on the same turn, but just like before, if your opponent has a 1-cost character down, it might make sense to leave 1 Dawn up and activate her ability on your next turn. And you could also just drop down a 2-cost blocker. At 4 Dawn, we can activate Bonnie's effect, drop down a 2-cost blocker, and still have 1 Dawn up for a leader ability. And if you're running a Rouge, this would be a great time to drop him down, as he'll allow you to reset 1 Dawn at the end of your turn. You may be tempted to drop down Tashigi, but the main value she gives is when you already have characters on the field to protect, as being 3 cost, she's pretty easy to remove, so if you drop her down too early, your opponent will just remove her and completely negate her value. At 6 Dawn, you want to once again play Cavendish or Smoker, but if you do play Cavendish, you can actually chain out a Tashigi at the same time with the 2 Dawn you get back, as well as your 1 Dawn left over. While this won't allow you to activate your leader ability next turn, what it will do is protect your Cavendish from any removal, such as Ben Beckman or other cards that you're expecting from your opponent next turn. And if you're worried about removal, you could also play Basil Hawkins or once again Carrot to freeze something. Going second, we get to 8 Dawn faster, which allows us to play Captain Kidd. And if we have Cavendish or Smoker on the field, we can restand Dawn and use his ability on the same turn. Now, if you didn't have Cavendish or Smoker on the field just yet, you can actually play both of them on your 8 Dawn turn, and still have 1 Dawn up for your leader ability. You do this by playing Cavendish, whose on-play effect restands 2 Dawn, and then with 5 Dawn left, you play Smoker, activate Smoker's ability, and end the turn with 1 Dawn standing. And as always, you could also play Hody Jones. Finally, at 10 Dawn, we once again have access to all of our cards, and you want to pair Shanks, Zoro, or the 10-cost Doflamingo alongside your Fortress to protect your life and swing at your opponent. The strength of this leader comes from our defensive utility, as between our leader ability, Captain Kidd, and our many different control options, we are a very difficult leader to finish off. We also have a good matchup into leaders that like to swarm the board, as with our leader ability, we can deflect multiple attacks and slow down the game to get to our late game characters. And of course, no leader is without a weakness, and for Bonney, while this is improved with the addition of Tashigi, removal in general still remains a problem, with difficult matchups into black and blue leaders who can disrupt our board development. We also lose some value from our leader ability against rush characters, since our opponent can attack with their leader first and then drop down that character and attack, not allowing us to use our leader ability to rest one of them. Our first game is against the blue-black leader Usopp, which I believe is a pretty difficult matchup since it runs a lot of removal and that's an area that we still struggle with. We don't like to see rush, and by playing Karate Coliseum, he essentially gives all of his Dressrosa characters rush when attacking our rested characters. And last but not least, their best play at 7 Dawn is Rebecca into Kyros into Zoro, and we don't have a reliable answer to this since they can remove our Tashigi before bouncing one of our 5 costs back to our hand. Our overall strategy isn't changing against this leader. We want to stall out the game, play it safe, and make it to end game to use our combination of Fortress and offense, but what changes is specific to what we want to stop from him. One is we want to try and limit the value he gets from his leader ability, where if we remove one of his Dressrosa cards and he has 5 or less cards in his hand, he gets to draw a card. The second is restricting or freezing Cavendish, who when attacking allows him to draw 2 cards and discard a card, greatly improving his hand. Looking back, playing Basil on my 6th Dawn turn wouldn't have been a terrible option, but I didn't like not having any of my mid to high cost characters outside of him, so I decided to mulligan and start the game. He plays Leo, who on play allows him to rest his leader, add 2 Dressrosa cards to his hand, and then discard one, and he adds Karate Coliseum and Kyros. For my turn, I simply play the 1-cost Bonney, keep 1 Dawn up, and end my turn. He then plays Karate Coliseum, which gives his Dressrosa characters rush on the turn they were played if they're attacking a character, and then swings 5k towards me, where I activate my leader ability and rest his Leo. And he plays a 2-cost blocker before ending his turn. At 4 Dawn, I could play Tashigi or Raizo, but knowing that Zoro is a staple in this deck, who on play allows him to KO a 4-cost or lower character, I don't think there's that much value to be gained from playing them just yet. So instead, I swing 5k at the rested Leo, and he actually decides to block this. Since he has 5 cards or less in his hand, this triggers his leader ability, and he draws a card. I then activate Bonney, who finds another Bonney, and luckily there's no restrictions for this searcher, so I add that to my hand. And with 3 Dawn remaining, I can play and activate another Bonney, and then add a 2k counter to my hand since I currently don't have any. I then keep 1 Dawn up to rest one of his characters, but unfortunately with Karate Coliseum on the field, I know he can just drop down another character and attack one of my Bonnies immediately. He opts for Cavendish, who allows you to draw a card when attacking, as you get to draw 2 and then discard 1. Now, I think this was a slight misplay, as it allows me to rest his leader, but he still has this Lido up to attack my other Bonney. He then drops down a 1-cost Rebecca and adds another 2-cost blocker to his hand, but for some reason he doesn't attack my Bonney with either Leo or Rebecca, but honestly, I'm happy to have her for another turn, so no questions asked. But I will say this is a bit of a lucky break for me. At 6 Dawn, I have Cavendish, Smoker, and Carrot in my hand, so I have a lot of options here. I'm pretty sure that a Kyros Rebecca play is coming next turn, so whatever 5-cost I play is likely going to get bounced back into my hand. So I thought about playing Carrot just to freeze their Cavendish in order to ensure that they don't draw more cards. I also thought about playing my own Cavendish followed up by the 3-cost Tashigi to see if they don't have the Zoro in their hand, then I could protect this Cavendish and keep her on the field by using Tashigi's effect. And while this wouldn't be a bad play, what I realized is I'm missing an 8-cost Kid for my hand, and since they graciously allowed my Supernova's Bonney to live, I might as well use her effect and see if I can find one. So I decided to play Cavendish and then activate Bonney's ability, which is great because we do find a Captain Kid and we add him to our hand to play him potentially next turn. And with 2 Dawn remaining, I attach one to my leader and swing 6 at Cavendish. I'm very confident he'll counter out, but at least it's 1 card out of his hand for now. To start his 7 Dawn turn, my opponent first wisely swings with Cavendish, as this will force me to use my leader ability on his leader and not any new card he plays down, and also allows him to draw 2 cards and discard 1. I had thought about countering out of this, but with only two 2k counters in my hand, and one of them being Tashigi, who I probably want to play on the field, I figured I better hold on to this for now and use it to protect one of my players in a later turn. He then KOs my Bonney, and then finally drops down Rebecca, into Kyros, into Frankie, also sending my Cavendish back to my hand. Now with 5 characters to none, some might say he's outpaced my board development, and they would be entirely right. But we're not dead yet, and we have a lot of powerful cards we can play, we just have to figure out how to stay alive long enough to play all of them. As I've mentioned before, at 8 Dawn we love to play Captain Kidd, but without a Cavendish or Smoker on the field to restand any Dawn, he really loses some value, so I decide first to go wide, as with 8 Dawn we can play Cavendish, Smoker, and still restand 1 Dawn for an 11 Dawn play on our 8 Dawn turn. But first I send 5k with my leader against Usopp, and you might be wondering, why did I ignore the 5k power blocker on the field? To start, Frankie has the on-KO effect where you can play a 3-cost or lower Dressrosa character from your trash. So if I KO him this turn, he'll be able to play either a Leo or Rebecca and add another card to his hand. You'll also notice that Usopp has exactly 5 cards in his hand, which means if I remove this Frankie, his leader ability will trigger and he'll draw an additional card, meaning if I take out this character, he'll add 2 cards to his hand. So with all that considered, I'd rather attack life and just add 1 card to his hand. But he actually deflects the attack, bringing his hand size down to 4, so overall, great success. I then drop down Smoker, activate 1 Dawn, end my turn, and really hope he doesn't have a Gravity Blade in his hand. He starts with Cavendish to ensure his ability goes off, so I take this opportunity to rest the Kyros and prevent him from swinging. I also use one of my 2k counters here, since he still has 3 active characters that could threaten my life and a lot of Dawns still up. He follows this up with a 7k swing from lead, but I don't want to use my Tashigi just yet, so I'm going to take the hit. I was really hoping for a 2k counter, but another Hody Jones enters the hand. He then attaches 3 to Rebecca and swings another 7k at life. Looking back, I could have countered out of this, but I know I want to play Captain Kidd next turn, and I wanted at least one 2k card in my hand to protect him. He then drops down another Cavendish, and I start my 10 Dawn turn. The good news is with both Cavendish and Smoker on the field, this will actually be my 13 Dawn turn. And with only 1 life remaining, I know for a fact I'm going to play down this Captain Kidd to form my defensive wall, but I'm just trying to figure out in what order I want to do things and what other cards I want to play alongside him. First thing I do is play him down and attach 1 Dawn, as even though I'm standing multiple here, I don't want to lose track and accidentally not leave 1 up for him. I then make sure to attack with Cavendish first, as once you activate Smoker's ability, you cannot restand any more Dawn. And I swing 6k at the 4k power Rebecca to remove her from the field. I then reactivate 1 Dawn with Smoker, attach 1 Dawn, and swing 8k at the 6k power Cavendish. He then counters with 2 2k counters, which is great to get out of his hand. And I want to keep my 3 remaining Dawn up for leader ability and a 2-cost blocker, so then I swing 5 at life and take my first life of the game. I then activate Captain Kidd's leader ability, but it's also here that I make the biggest mistake of the game, so I want to just explain my thought process through this. Now I know that next turn he'll have 5 characters that can attack my Kidd, and 10 Dawn available to boost up their power. And if I bring out a single blocker and use my Bonnie's leader ability, I can stop 2 of those attacks. But he can swing 9k with Kyros, and with 0 Dawn invested, force out one of my 2k counters. And at that point in time, I would activate my leader ability, rest one of his Cavendishes who have the next highest power. But even then, he would still have his leader, another Cavendish, and a Frankie to attack with. He would then force out almost all the cards in my hand to counter out and keep Captain Kidd alive. But then I thought, if I drop down 2 blockers instead, I can deflect 3 attacks. And even if he removes one of my blockers, I'll have the other one up to deflect any big hit. But in full transparency, I had tunnel vision. I was only thinking about what was in front of me and not the toolkits that blue has to offer. So I dropped down both blockers, end my turn, and the first thing he does is red rock my Eustace to the bottom of my deck. So in hindsight, what should I have done? Well, 2 things. The first, I should have brought out a Rosinante instead of Killer. I think I just didn't see him in my hand as the cards were all pushed together. And second would have been to use Captain Kidd's ability to bring out the 3-cost Tashigi, as I would have both removal protection and KO protection now on the board for him. And while that was a major setback, we still have our leader ability and 2 blockers on the board, so this game is far from over. He then attacks my Cavendish with his own, and I stopped to think about my leader ability here, as I'm not sure if I should use it on the 9k power Kyros or rest his Cavendish to prevent him from drawing again. While I don't like him adding another card to his hand, I decide to rest Kyros, as my goal this turn is to keep Cavendish, Smoker, and at least one of my blockers alive to play down another Captain Kidd next turn. So I decide that letting him draw an additional card is worth me potentially using another 13 Dawn on my next turn. I then discard Raizo to counter out. He then attacks with his other Cavendish, drawing another card, and I decide to use Carrot as a counter, since while she can be useful to freeze one of these Cavendishes, I won't be playing her in the next turn or two, and I would rather keep up both of my blockers for next turn. With his 4 remaining Dawn, he drops down Zoro, activates his effect to kill one of my blockers, and then swings 6k at Cavendish for the 3rd time. And since I have another one in my hand, I'd rather discard that and keep my one on the field. And after what feels like the longest turn in the world, he swings his final hit of 5k towards my life. And unfortunately, the only 2 cards I have as counters are 2 that I would like to play next turn alongside my Captain Kidd. But given the fact that I already have a blocker on the field, and also that I wouldn't be able to stomach it if he bottom decks another one of my kids, I decide to use Rosinante to counter out. We then start our turn and draw another Tashigi, which is great since we plan on playing one and we'll still have another 2k counter in our hand. And then just like the previous turn, we start by playing a Captain Kidd and attaching 1 Dawn to him just so we don't forget. I then attach my 1 remaining active Dawn to Smoker and swing 8k at Cavendish. He then decides to block with Frankie, whose on KO effect triggers, bringing back a 3-cost blocker onto the field rested. I then target his Cavendish with my own, restanding 2 Dawn and forcing out a 1k counter from his hand. Now, I want to keep up my 2 remaining Dawn, 1 for leader ability and 1 to attach to my killer, but I realize now that I didn't actually activate my smoker ability here, so I could have swung 6k instead of 5k with my leader. I also left up the 3-cost blocker, since if I remove it, it allows him to play a card without sacrificing one of the ones he has on the field, and with 2 Hody Jones in my hand, I'm really not worried about a blocker, so this might give him a false sense of security later on. He then counters out again, going down to 4 cards in his hand, and then I activate Captain Kid's ability, bring out my TCG, and end my turn. He then starts by attacking with a 6k power Cavendish. This doesn't threaten my Captain Kid, but he's just using it to build his hand size back up. I take this opportunity to rest the Kyros, the strongest character on the board that can actually threaten my kid. He then attacks with his second Cavendish, drawing another card, before dropping down a Rebecca into Kyros and bouncing my Tashigi back into my hand. He then attaches his remaining Dawn into Kyros, swinging 12k at my kid, and I block with Killer. And since he has a Dawn attached, I'm able to draw a card when this happens. I add a 1-cost Bonnie to my hand, and then he ends his turn, and I add a Cavendish. While I have many cards in my hand right now, I really only see one card I want to play, which is the 9-cost Shanks. This is because you can't benefit from Cavendish's effect if there's 2 of them on the field, and I don't want to play Hody Jones and go down to 0 life. And while I could play the Bonnie Searcher to look for another killer blocker, I only run 3 of them in this deck, and since I've already played 2 of them, there's a pretty slim chance of me actually finding one. Since I only need 9 Dawn for Shanks, I start things off by attaching 1 to Captain Kid and then swinging 9k at the Cavendish. He doesn't block or counter, so finally we've removed the Cavendishes from the board. Our next play is to spend our 9 Dawn, drop down Shanks, and remove one of their Kyros. We then attack with Cavendish first, as once again we want to use this ability before Smoker. He then counters out with a 2k, so we follow this up with a 7k swing with Smoker with Banish, threatening to trash one of his life. He wisely uses his blocker, which activates his leader ability, and he draws a card. With 3 Dawn remaining, I could play Bonnie and look for either a 2k counter or another useful card, but he has 6 cards in his hand right now, and I can feel the endgame coming, so I decide rather than do that, I want to swing 7k with my leader and either take another life or get 2 cards out of his hand. And now that the board development has leaned towards my favor, I'm not worried about losing next turn, as he has 3 attackers, and between my Captain Kid, my Bonnie ability, and the counter in my hand, I'm not worried about losing next turn. So I decide to get aggressive, attaching 2 to leader, swinging 7k, and getting 2 cards out of his hand. I then end my turn, and he decides that I have no blocker on the field, he's going to go all in on my Captain Kid, attaching 6 to Kyros and swinging 15k. And in all reality, this is probably the right number, because in my hand I could buff him up to 14k, and I would have done so if that would have kept him alive. So unfortunately, we have to let him go, but he's done his job, he's kept us safe, and now we use my leader ability to rest this Usopp. And with 4 Dawn remaining, I expected him to either play a 4-cost blocker, or attach 1 or 2 to Rebecca, swing that, and then play a 2 or 3-cost blocker instead. And so he decides to play the 4-cost Frankie and end his turn. Now, in the One Piece TCG, there are 2 scenarios in which we go for game. The first is when we know we can win, as our opponent's resources, either number of life and blockers, isn't enough to defend our incoming attacks. This is the ideal situation and one you're trying to find in every game you play, as it secures the victory. But this is not one of those scenarios. This is more gray, as I'm not sure if I can win, but I'm also not sure if I'm about to lose next turn. And if I do target Kyros with an attack, he can block with Frankie, activate its effect, play down a Leo or Rebecca, draw a card, activate leader ability, draw another card, and all of a sudden I might be out-resourced by him. However, I do have Hody Jones in my hand, which will take out my last life, but I can use this to rest his Frankie and go straight for life. And not only this, but he only costs 7 Dawn to play, so once I do that, I can restand 3 and have 6 more Dawn to work with. All in all, I like my chances, and I decide that this is the best play. So I drop down Hody Jones, rest his Frankie, and rest his Rebecca. Now, to take away as many resources as I can, I figured I should start with my banished character and swing 7k to either get 2 cards out of his hand or banish the top of his life. It was a counterless card, so not that impactful, but still the principle was there. It could have been a 2k counter. We then attach 1 to Cavendish and swing another 7k while restanding 2 Dawn. This attack is also successful, and he's now down to 1 life. With 5 cards in hand, I then decide to swing 7k with leader, which he then counters out of with a 2k and a 1k. I then blame this on mental fatigue. I forgot to restand another one with my smoker, but I should have swung 10k into 12k, but we live and we learn. And then finally, against 4 cards in hand, I swing 12k and secure the victory. Our second game is against Blackbeard, and against this leader, we actually do a 180 on our strategy. While in most scenarios, we want to slow down the game, make it to end game, and use our high cost characters, against Blackbeard, we actually want to speed things up and take him out before we get there. This is because his endgame directly counters ours, as he can negate all of our effective cards. To start, we're not going to be able to use Shanks or Dofi's abilities since he's going to turn off our on-play effects. We can still activate Captain Kid, but as soon as Blackbeard gets to 10 Dawn, he's going to start chain dropping his 10 cost Teach, negating Captain Kid's effect, and then turning off our leader ability so we can't even rest any of their cards. They will also have 1 to 2 Burgesses on the field at this time, swinging 8 to 9k power every turn. They also run multiple copies of Finger Pistol, which will allow them to KO one of our 5-cost characters, but the good news is this isn't searchable within the deck, so we just have to hope that they don't draw it. Key cards for this matchup include Tashigi and Basil Hawkins for some removal protection, but offensively, our MVP is Hody Jones, who starting at 7 Dawn allows us to get aggressive with Rush. Against Blackbeard, we want to go second to take that Dawn curve away from them, but unfortunately he gets the choice, so he forces us to go first. We don't have a 1-cost Bonney in our hand, but we do have Basil Hawkins, Cavendish, and Smoker, so we're going to keep it. As you know from before, Basil Hawkins is a great answer into removal decks. He activates 2 This Is My Age, drawing a Martial D-Teach, and then drawing another Martial D-Teach. At 3 Dawn, we draw exactly the card we're looking for, a Hody Jones that we can play in 2 turns. But with nothing to play this turn, we just attach 2 to leader and swing 7k. That takes the first life, and then I end my turn. To start his turn, he swings 7k right back, I don't counter out, add a Shanks to my hand, and then he drops down a Dock Q and ends his turn. Since he hasn't turned off my on plays yet, I want to continue my level of aggression, and I'm going to do that with Cavendish, who will allow me to restand 2 Dawn to swing a stronger leader attack. Now you might think it's best to leave 1 Dawn up to activate my leader ability, but if he has a way to remove this Cavendish with Dock Q, he's going to rest him before he does so. And as I mentioned before, we're all aboard the aggression train and there are no breaks. So I'm attached 2 to leader and swing another 7k to see if I can take out a life. Which we do, and if you've watched my Blackbeard guide, you'd also know that this is their area of weakness as they don't run a lot of counter, so any strong hits, especially in early to mid game, are likely to be successful. Now the only way he can take out this Cavendish is by using a finger pistol, or a combination of Stronger and Black Hole, or Stronger, Van Augur, and Dock Q. He starts off by dropping the 1-cost stage, discarding a This Is My Age, and then adding another Dock Q to his hand, which makes me think that he doesn't have what he needs to remove my Cavendish. He then spends 5 Dawn to drop down Van Augur and swings 5k at life, and considering I only have 1 card with counter in my hand, I hold on to it and go down to 3 life. He then discards a card to turn off our on-play effects and ends his turn. We are now in a great position at 7 Dawn, as we could either drop down Basil Hawkins and keep 1 Dawn up, or drop down Hody Jones. But since we have Cavendish on the field, even if we spend all 7 on Hody, we'll still be able to restand 2 Dawn. And even with our on-plays turned off, he still gains rush, and we won't add a card from our life to our hand. Now, in this scenario, I have 3 attackers, but there are 2 triggers that I'm worried about. The first is Finger Pistol, which can be activated to remove a 5-cost character, meaning I want to attack with Cavendish first to ensure I restand 2 Dawn. The second is Black Hole, whose trigger allows him to negate the effects of one of my characters, meaning he could take away my Hody Jones rush and prevent him from attacking. I start with a 6k swing from Cavendish and restand 2 Dawn. He discards Shiryu as a 2k counter, and then I follow this up with another 6k swing for my leader. This attack is successful, and we immediately follow this up with an 8k swing from Hody to bring him down to 1 life. I then pass things over to him, and he rests Van Augur to bring Hody Jones to a 4-cost before playing a Finger Pistol from his hand. He then activates his stage, trashing 1 card and adding a 2-cost Vasco shot to his hand. He then attaches 2 Dawn to leader and swings 7k at my Cavendish, and I'm once again very happy I didn't use a counter on the previous turn, as I still have my 2k counter in my hand to counter out of this and keep him alive. He then plays the 2-cost Vasco shot blocker, turns off my on plays, and ends his turn. I then start my 9 Dawn turn, and while I could play Shanks or Captain Kidd from my hand, we know from the beginning of the game that he added 2 10-cost teaches to his hand, and considering next turn is his 10 Dawn play, we can expect 1 to come out. And what Blackbeard excels at in the late game is stopping big hits, since he can use Teach's ability to negate one of our attackers, and then also use his blocking ability to stop another. So if I drop down a Kidd or a Shanks, all he's going to do is play his Teach, negate their ability, prevent them from attacking next turn, and then drop down another Teach and do the same thing. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to go as wide as possible, as while he can use Blackbeard to negate one of our attackers and then block another attack, if we have 3 or 4 characters on the field, he's only able to stop one of them, and these 6 or 7k swings will make it through. And with Cavendish on the field and Smoker in my hand, I could turn this 9 Dawn turn into a 12 Dawn play. And after some quick mental math, I realized I could play Smoker, use Cavendish and Smoker to restand 3 Dawn, play Basil Hawkins, and still have 1 Dawn up for my leader ability. Now, I could target Dock Q or Van Augur here, but on KO they allow him to draw a card, and I'm trying to get cards out of his hand and go for game, as I'm also not worried about losing with them attacking me next turn. He then discards 2 cards, confirming he doesn't have any 2k counters in his hand, and deflects the attack. I then use Smoker's ability to restand my final Dawn, before swinging 5k with leader at his life. He intercepts with his Vasco shot blocker, so we play down Basil Hawkins and end our turn. He starts things off by activating his stage, discarding a 6-cost liberation, and adding another Vasco shot to his hand. He then makes a slight mistake here, as if he's going to drop down the 10-cost teach, he should do this prior to attacking to ensure I can't use my leader ability. But this doesn't actually change anything, as even if he attacked with both leader and Van Augur, I have Basil Hawkins and a 2k and a 1k in my hand that could have stopped both. He then drops down the 10-cost teach, negating our leader ability, negating Smoker's ability, and preventing Smoker from attacking on our next turn. With 3 attackers against 1 blocker, 1 life, and 3 cards in hand, one of which we know is a counterless Martial D-Teach, I'm feeling pretty confident that I can go for game. It also works out nicely that we picked up the 2-cost Rosinante, as Cavendish will restand 2 rested Dawn, meaning I can essentially play him for free and still use all my Dawn to go for the attack. So I decided to play him down first before swinging 8k with Cavendish, which is kind of like a feeler hit. If the attack is successful, I can likely go for game this turn. If not, he would have to discard 2 cards, leaving only the counterless Martial D-Teach in his hand, and that means I could just swing 5k with leader to either take him down to 0 life or force his Teach to block. But with the attack being successful, I decided to split up my 8 remaining Dawn to force out 2 10k power attacks from my leader and Basil. Looking back, maybe it would have made sense to swing 12k and then 8k, as with the first attack, he would not have enough to counter, so he'd have to get rid of his Teach. But with my strategy, unless he has 3 2k counters in his hand, I'm going to win the game. He blocks the first attack with his Teach, so I attach all my remaining Dawn and swing 10k with Bonney into his life, which is enough to take him out and end the game. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you found this video helpful and you're now ready to use Bonney to control your opponent and win in the late game. Unless you're playing against Blackbeard, in which you want to kind of win in the early to mid game. But either way, I'll catch you next time.